All right. Welcome. I'm Katie Roome.
I'm David Roome.
And this is The Signal. Today, we're going to be talking about messages in fiction, kind of inspired by Alexander Hellene's article.
All fiction is message fiction.
That's right. And you don't have to have read it, but the link is in the description. We're just going to use it as a springboard to talking about messages and themes and stuff. So before we dive in, real quick, I'll go through my indie news. All of these are bits of news articles that are on Periapsis Press. So I've linked the article that I wrote in the description, and then from there, there's all of the relevant links to get you where you want to go. William Jeffrey Rankin released a novella. We interviewed Invocations of the Submortal. Really great suspense, weird horror stuff. So I am really looking forward to checking out Sherlock Holmes and Carnegie, the Black Beast of Ipswich. Dance of the Nutcracker is on pre-order. We've reviewed both of the previous books in this series. Really excited about that one as well. And then there's 3 Kickstarters that are ongoing. I believe Penance goes up on the 5th. So I've linked that article as well. And from there, you can get to all of their Kickstarters. Very excited. We've reviewed books from all of these authors. We've also actually reviewed Penance. It's being re-released. So pretty excited about that as well. Upcoming review, I read Kroese.
Kroese. You need to work on getting these pronunciations straight.
I'm a reader. I don't say things out loud. And I suppose I am saying things out loud now. It needs to be changed. So I read this a while ago and recently was going back through my notes and wanted to do a review of it, but realized that a lot of people have written really nice blog articles about it already. And so I will be reposting a guest post. So keep an eye out for that. This is my tagline for it. A sci-fi alternate history adventure that juxtaposes aliens and Vikings, analytical problem solving, and high stakes action. My top 3 for it were the action was pretty well done. Very punchy. My second one, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it was originally a manga, but the anime Dr. Stone. I watched that anime before I had read this book. And so the being thrown back into a time before you had access to things ready made and you had to do everything from scratch. A lot of the sciencey sequences appeal to me in a similar way to the anime that had. My guest reviewer was less impressed with those, but I thought they were fun. And then my other thing that I really appreciated was the Vikings were fully fledged characters, and they weren't treated as stupid because they were, from a time period before ours. It was assumed that they could understand, and they weren't like Neanderthal, like subhuman or anything like that, as compared to like the sci-fi characters that had traveled back in time. So keep an eye out for that. Right. And then we can get into the discussion. So we're going to be going off of Alexander Hellene's All Fiction is Message Fiction. And just a couple of the points that he makes that sort of generally is all fiction contains messages and postmodernism is nonsense. And then a quote that we probably will talk about quite a bit is something as relatively simple as good is worth fighting for, the hero saves the day and gets the girl, or sacrificing oneself for one's friends is a worthy endeavor, is also a message.
And just quick, want to point out that idea in this article is not necessarily like the main point of the article, but it is something that he mentions a couple times, that idea of even basic plot elements being key parts of the message of a story.
Yep. So going to do this while we talk. We should probably start with saying that we agree with the point of the article that messages matter in fiction. He kind of makes a broader point as well. He says everything we do is imbued with meaning beyond its ordinary trappings. And I don't remember if that is something that he said or if he was quoting someone else at that point.
Well, that just goes along with the general point of his article being all fiction is message fiction, right? So there's some different aspects to this article, but I think one of them is that, you know, you're intending to communicate something when you write a story, or unless you're a postmodernist, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of goes along with that idea.
Yeah. And he is coming from a perspective of anti-postmodernism. So that's the mindset that he has while he's writing this. But we just felt that perhaps the article could potentially give people, both writers and readers, the impression that messages in fiction are a lot simpler than they actually are, and that for writers that could be a tripping point in writing,
especially in the kind of pulp rev type circles. I feel like there's a tendency to say the point of stories is entertainment, you know. There's a real bias away from kind of literary type stuff towards more simpler action-oriented plots and things like that. So I think, again, like, not saying there's anything wrong with an article. I think just the way we would talk about theme might be a little bit different, or kind of have some different emphases.
Mm-hmm. And I think that talking about messages is also important for readers. That's part of why I try to do that in my reviews. Talk about what I thought the theme or the message was, especially since so many messages in TradPub are abrasive, to say the least, or subversive, of course. I want people to start thinking about what stories are saying about the world we live in, and about us as people.
Hmm.
So I think it's important to discuss messages in fiction, and
Mhm.
we are in agreement
Mhm.
with Alexander Hellene that
Mhm.
that it is important. One thing that I feel that we have to be more careful about is sort of the dismissal of the reader's role
Mhm.
in the message, because we're reacting against postmodernism, where meaning is described by the individual who's consuming, the reader, the viewer, the audience.
Mhm.
We have a tendency to swing hard into, well, what did the author intend? And I think Alexander Hellene knows this.
Yeah, and it wasn't
it's
the
just
emphasis of his article.
Right. And I have a visual aid
Mhm.
that I'll pull back up here. What was it? This one? Yeah. Okay, so I think that the way that I think about theme is having three components, and these quotes are from Alexander Hellene's article, so he definitely understands what he's talking about as far as this goes. It's just that the way that it's talked about might make you think that only the author's intention matters.
Yeah.
So first is the author intention. That's what the author wanted you to know, wanted you to come away from the story with. When I do author interviews, I like to end with the question, what do you hope your readers are going to take away from your stories, your fiction? And that's always very, very revealing about them as a person and as a writer. So there's no denying that is a major part of theme and messages in general, because the author is bringing their worldview to bear on their story. The second thing that I think that is important is the story consequences. So setting, character development, plot, obviously, the things that happen. And he says all of the stuff inside the action, the stuff below the surface that some call subtext. And then the other thing is the timeliness and the reader experience. And I think that we shouldn't deny that.
Just one thing about the story consequences. So Alexander Hellene does make this point.
Yes.
Because he talks about how even simple things like the good guy winning, and I think he talked about getting the girl, maybe.
Yes.
Hero saves the day and gets the girl. That can be like a theme and message, and he talks about both theme and message. I'm not sure if he really makes a distinction, and I'm not sure that we really want to make a distinction there.
I think he's kind of lumping theme together with like both like author worldview imposed on their fiction, like the superversive movement, which I would say is kind of they're not really themes, but they're a pattern in the movement, genre, framework. If you have an adventure novel, the hero's going to save the girl, right? Like, so I tend to talk about theme more.
Yeah.
But messages is kind of something that covers all of that.
Mean, I think one way you could distinguish between the two is I think if you were looking at, and we've talked about theme a bit more in, I think, a different episode, is that I think theme, if executed well, is something that kind of has the appearance of flowing very naturally from the story and can be sometimes a little bit hidden or abstract or not really it's not really something that would be good if it was like voiced by the characters in the story, right? It should be something that's more abstract and organic. Maybe messages could be something that's, like an instance of more preaching or very in your face kind of statement of theme in the story. That would maybe be how I would distinguish it, but I think we're open to having different things. I think probably Katie and I in our conversation are going to be kind of just assuming that messages and themes are sort of interchangeable.
Probably focusing mostly on theme.
Yeah, because I mean, I think for me, I don't really like stories that have the characters just openly stating themes or preaching. Like if the author intends to convey something,
it's much.
I don't like it when it's just in the mouth of a character.
Right. It's much better to have it as a consequence of the story. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to the author's abilities if it is done well. Sure. Okay. So Isaac Young says, I think what he's saying is that a message reflects that the author is going after a statement rather than a dialogue with the reader. And that actually gets at what I think theme probably is, which I made a slide for talking about later, but we could talk about it now because we had talked about theme as arc or as a question answer.
Yeah. So, and I think I agree with what Isaac is saying here. I don't really agree with his next statement necessarily, but yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways to define theme. A good definition that I heard once a long time ago is that the theme of the story is how the reader's worldview should change as a result of reading the story. And of course, it's a very nice definition. I think it could even just be, exposing a new worldview or a new idea to the reader. So there's kind of an arc. The theme sort of takes the reader on an arc of, like, maybe they're in worldview A, and then the events of the story kind of guide them into seeing worldview B.
And bumping stuff. I generally think of theme as being more of a dialogue, more of a question answer type of scenario. One of the ones that I have talked about recently would be the first Drosselmeyer book. Paul Thompson has a very intentional theme that's very well crafted that presents the question of who's responsible for providing for and protecting the weak when those in authority are the perpetrators, and what is appropriate action. And then through the course of the events of the story provides a possible answer to that discussion. But that's how I like my themes to play out, because I like to think myself. And so if the author, rather than saying this is what you should think, instead presents a question, a serious and difficult question, and lets me, as I read the story, decide whether or not I agree with the characters in the way that they are answering it, and the way that the story is answering it. Mm-hmm. I find that much more compelling than typical message fiction.
Mm-hmm. I think even this is really getting abstract, and I'll just say this, and we should probably go on, but I almost sometimes think story has a good theme when there's some plausible deniability that is actually the theme of the story. So that kind of gets at what you're saying about, it's like you're presenting this idea, but you're not forcing the reader to accept that idea to make sense of the story. It's like, this is a way that you can interpret the story to make it make sense. But if you want to just keep worldview A and never shift to worldview B, you could.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It lets you continue to be your own person
Mm-hmm.
rather than NPC.
Yeah. Should go back to that slide.
Oh yeah. I was trying to remember.
I think we were just talking about the second point a bit.
Oh yeah, we were talking about story consequences a little bit. And then the last one is part of what we sort of tend to lean away from when we are reacting to postmodernism. But timeliness, like when the book came out, and reader experience when I, as a reader, interact with the story, and what I bring to it are also very important to theme, and I think probably to message as well. Alexander Hellene talks about how he didn't understand A Tale of Two Cities or didn't appreciate it until he came back to it. And that, I think, is a good example of how a reader is interacting with the story and the theme in order to like find that meaning. Every time I go back to Lord of the Rings, I get something different, right? Every time I read Harry Potter or watch a movie that I've seen a million times, I'm bringing something different from my own experiences to it, and so I can get something different out. Fiona Wolf points out some messages are more timeless than others, and that probably does contribute to the applicability and the popularity of certain stories. And I can't help but agree that A Christmas Carol is pretty much the best Dickens work. Just want to talk about just thought it would be interesting to talk about some examples of different, how different books fell into those three. One that we could talk about would be like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. Like take author intention, and you could say a mythology for England, for example. And if you don't think that is the author's intention, I tackled that in episode 3. If Tolkien was crafting a message that was specific to England, was doing something with a specific people and place in mind, then we would expect to see that borne out in the concept. And then how I interact with it as not English is different than someone who is English. There are way more universally applicable themes in Lord of the Rings, obviously, but I thought that one was one that, since it's under debate whether the author actually intended it,
Mm-hmm.
would be one to bring up. Because of that that duality, well, three things, but the two that I'm talking about right now, author intent and story consequences, I don't see consequences of the story contradicting the assertion that Tolkien intended it as a mythology for England, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with this topic. I
Sure.
guess I didn't. Maybe you could elaborate on how, because I thought the mythology for England thing was more of a sort of setting
Sure.
thing than a theme.
Sure.
Um,
Valid.
So, I mean, the same sort of thing applies, right? Where, you can write and be communicating a certain. You can be trying to communicate certain things with your setting.
Yes.
That certain people are going to get or not get, depending on how familiar they are with that.
Yes.
That setting or what you're trying to do. That of course doesn't mean that the author didn't have an intention and meaning and stuff in mind.
Yeah, I did. I was thinking of it in a story consequences being a thematic message drawn out of the setting.
Okay.
As opposed to the plot.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I think the more timeless a story is, I think a little bit less interesting it is.
Sure.
I like hero's journey type stories. I think that's pretty common arc has sort of a timeless quality to it. But I don't know that when stuff gets really epic or the theme is just about something like the nature of power. Like people always talk about Dune as because it says some timely things about, they say it says some timely things about, the nature of power and its ability to corrupt. And I'm just like, I don't care. I don't know. I think other kinds of themes are a little bit more interesting myself. Like themes of romance or just religious themes or things like that.
Yeah.
Like I guess all that to say, I don't necessarily think that a writer's goal should be, I need to make this as timeless as possible.
Yeah.
Right? You as the writer are free to choose what themes you want. And you can have some big timeless theme, right? Like the hero with good morals wins and gets the girl, but you don't have to try to make every element of your story as general as possible. And I think that the good stories kind of say really interesting specific things, right? You guys are talking about Christmas Carol versus Tale of Two Cities. My favorite Dickens work is Great Expectations. And that says some really interesting things about the nature of romantic love and infatuation, which is probably a more specific thing than what either A Christmas Carol or A Tale of Two Cities is about. But I think it's really interesting and was really interesting to me when I read it, and something that I thought about a long time after I read that book in my own life, because I could kind of see actually the timelessness of those themes, right? But it's a much more specific thing, right? It's not a general, easily applicable to everyone's experience or some kind of general truth about humanity at a very large scale. It's more of a more specific thing.
Yeah, I would like to actually talk about Alexander Hellene's book, The Last Ancestor, here, because I felt like the theme of that work was a bit I guess generic when I first read it. Good. I like, this is not contradicting what I said in my review at all. I think the theme is that you should do the right thing even if there's consequences, and the impact of the story on that theme is largely character driven, but there's also plot elements. I don't want to spoil anything, but the climax presents the sort of traditional "would you die for your faith?" question, and the answer is, will you do the right thing, right? And going back to what you said, I found the parallel theme to be much, much more interesting. And maybe that's part of my experience as a reader, bringing my own faith and my own experience with stories that have sort of similar themes growing up within the faith. But I thought that the character development, not of the main character, but of his best friend, and the way that he interacted with the theme, to be much more compelling because it seemed more timely to me. Are you willing to be made are you willing to be weak? Are you willing to be vulnerable and to lose your sense of belonging, your sense of place in the world, your connections with your people, for your faith, by doing the right thing? But that is a slightly more specific theme, like you were saying. So that could be that universal themes are appeal to a wide audience, but specific themes can end up being more compelling, stick with you longer, maybe because they're unique as far as.
Yeah, I mean, that's my opinion about fiction. Is I don't really have a reason to read something or engage with something if it's not unique. And I mean, I'm not saying everything has to be unique, but just for myself, the more unique something is, I think the more I appreciate it. And kind of like Katie's talking about with Last Ancestor, it's not like the whole entire plot has to be unique, right? You can have the hero saves the day and gets the girl, but some of those extra elements and themes, drawing from personal experience or just doing things differently, is something I like about indie fiction, and I really appreciate about it. So I think that those kind of, I think I often think of trad pub themes in trad pub works as being these kind of general, terrible, subversive things. And in indie fiction, you can get these really interesting, sometimes kind of wacky, sometimes a little bit unpolished, but really interesting things and ideas, which are fun even if you don't necessarily agree with them, right? So that kind of going back to what we were talking about, how the reader doesn't necessarily have to be convinced by the theme. I think it's kind of interesting reading some things that I don't necessarily agree with, but are vivid and interesting ideas.
Yep, it's not been, like we said, polished all the heck. Fiona Wolf kind of interacts kind of with some of the stuff that we're saying here, talking about matching the market and I think you see that in themes, like we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Should we talk about Mordu and Kairis?
Yeah, do you have slides for that?
I don't.
Okay. So I think going back to something that we were talking about earlier about, the different aspects of theme and message and reader experience. So, we don't want to take the postmodern attitude that it's all up to the reader. But at the same time, I think there are ways where it's not, other things matter than just what the author's intention was, right? And I think the simplest example, and this is maybe a more extreme example than what we're going to talk about, but I think the simplest example of how that breaks down is if you just didn't do a very good job as an author of writing a story that supports your intended theme, right? So you could say all day long, I intended this, but you didn't actually do the work to let the reader actually understand what that is. And something interesting, I just want to maybe pick on Alexander's article here a little bit more. At the end of the article, he talks, and he's trying to convince the reader of the article that, all fiction. He gives the example of how, maybe you just want to write a story about stuff that happens. But if some critic came to you and said, oh, I see, the purpose of, or the theme of your story is Y, where Y is the opposite of X, what you sort of maybe believe or intended to communicate, if you did actually intend to communicate something, he's like, wouldn't you push back? You wouldn't just shrug and say, whatever, I don't write message fiction, right? So I think when I'm presented with that sort of hypothetical scenario, my reaction to a critic saying, oh, the theme is the opposite of what you intended, my reaction would be, oh my gosh, that's interesting. Why did you use the opposite of what I intended? I probably did something wrong. Right. So, I think there's some leeway in there between like a critic deliberately misinterpreting or putting their own meaning into your work and a critic who exactly gets what you're saying, or maybe just takes what you say the theme is at face value, and somebody who's sort of engaging with it, trying to understand for themselves what the theme is, and then maybe coming to a different conclusion than what you stated. So the worst case scenario of that is you just did a poor job as a writer. Not the worst case scenario is what we're going to talk about next, which is a well-written story that's got some interesting thematic issues that sort of subvert what everybody is assuming is the actual theme of the story. So the story that we're going to talk about is Mordu and Kairis in the White City by Skyla Hermstrom. So this was a part of a collection of short stories that he put out. I believe it was the summer of 2020, because that was when our daughter was born. He started a short story book club that I think only went for one
short story.
But a bunch of us read and reviewed Mordu and Kairis in the White City. And my article about that story is the only review that I wrote that's on Periapsis Press. But it's a really great story. Did you want to talk about what what the sort of theme of it was, or should I?
Sure.
keep going?
So maybe
we could give a little overview of the
Yeah.
plot too.
So for people who aren't familiar, Mordu is the warrior, right?
Yep. And
and Kairis is the
yeah.
monkey.
Yeah. And I mean, again, can't say this enough that this is a great story.
Yes.
Really engaging. Everybody loves Skyla Hermstrom. You know, you should buy and read his stuff.
Yes. Yep. We've reviewed this story on Periapsis Press.
Yeah.
We think this is a good story.
I to be honest, I don't read I don't read a ton of stuff. Because often I just, you know, I'm a busy person. I don't find things compelling. This was a great story. Kept me engaged. Reading left me with a lot to think about, and I think it's an example of, even if you have problems with something, if an author has an interesting intention, even if there's issues in the execution, there's something that is there's something of value. So I don't want to give anybody the idea that we think this is a bad story.
Right.
We're going to be really, really critical here about the themes, but because it sort of encapsulates one of the potential issues we see with oversimplifying messages in fiction. It's a great case study for, I think, maybe how Alexander Hellene's article could be misinterpreted, and maybe some of the sort of extreme thinking about theme that we see in Pulp Rev as kind of critics of that. I mean, again, there's lots of good things about Pulp Rev, but I think there's this sometimes kind of extreme views about theme that we'd want to kind of caution people against. To think critically about, for sure. So in the story, Mordu and Kairis they meet a band of travelers, sort of going the same way they are, or they need protection. And this is it's a sort of Conan the Barbarian type story set in a sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy world that may or may not be our world. So just a little bit about the setting, because setting definitely matters too. And spoilers, because we're going to be talking about the theme. Yeah. So I hope you guys don't mind. The band of travelers has a couple of kids with them, and there's two women. One is the sexy leader, and the other is the more motherly type who's taking care of the kids. But she's like a young woman. Young woman, yep. Everybody's young. Not a mom herself. Right. And Mordu and Kairis accompany them to the White City where they live. And it's very mysterious and off-putting, slightly off-putting. Kind of has an appearance of being technologically advanced. Yep. And basically come to find out that the city and the youth of the people, I think too, is all being run off of children, one child at a time, I believe. But yeah, they have some kind of machine that they suck the life force out of a kid through a torturous process that does something that basically gives everybody eternal youth and health and stuff. And the response of Mordu when and so just another plot point. So in the process of discovering this, and it's like a horrific moment when Mordu and Kairis discover this, they also discover that this young woman who they met, who is bringing these kids to the city, has been part of this process where they repeatedly go and either kidnap or like find orphans and bring them to the city for the purpose of being these sacrificial children. But this has gone on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't like the first time that she's brought kids
right. In. And she kind of tips them off.
Yeah. She's involved in the process of them discovering what is going on.
Yeah.
The creepy leader is revealed to be, you know, the sort of villainous mastermind.
Mm-hmm.
But this other female character was involved in this too.
Right. The leader is creepy sexy, and the young woman is
wholesome
sexy,
which is another well we'd have to talk about this sometime, but sort of another issue that I have with a lot of pulp rev type books. I don't mean to pick on pulp rev stuff so much, but you know, I think sometimes they don't do a good job of, like, there's very specific roles that women fall into in these stories, and it's like there's like the creepy, like, sexy witch, or the like the virginal put on a pedestal wife material.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have a lot of depth, and I mean, again, like Mordu and Kairis in the White City is a short story. Not all the characters have to be really deep. They can fall into these sort of trope-like categories. That's totally fine. It works. So
Mordu's response is to destroy the machinery and kill everybody except the girl and the children, who
girl being the young woman.
Yes, young woman. Sorry, not the girl. The young woman.
She's like in her early 20s or something.
And take them to sort of nomadic village.
Yeah, there's another group of nomads that they met up with earlier in the story, which I think is where they met these travelers going to the White City.
Yeah, they were being attacked by these nomadic rural people.
Yep, and then I think they go back to that same group.
Yeah, because it turns out they were trying to save the kids.
Yep. They had cool centipede armor. That's one detail that I remember.
So the theme is actually, because the story is written in response to another short, I think it's a short story, another story.
Yeah, well, you should talk about this. So this is another interesting thing. So basically, Mordu and Kairis in the White City is written as a sort of alternative to a really famous short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think that's the name of the story.
Yeah, I think so. I wasn't sure how to pronounce the last.
And so one interesting thing about this is that so I had heard of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and I think I had read about it or read it. It's like really short. You can find it online pretty easily. I didn't necessarily have that in mind when I read the story, so I wasn't thinking about that. You hadn't read the story, you had never even heard of it.
No.
So when she read it, she wasn't drawing any comparisons at all.
Yeah.
Had no point. And that's kind of that's another point where maybe theme can break down. It's like you are deliberately drawing off of something and trying to respond to it, where if that's a really important part of what you're trying to do, then your story might be less accessible to somebody who's not familiar with that thing.
Yep. I think this one was pretty accessible.
Yeah, it's pretty accessible anyway.
Because the premise is pretty simple, but in a more complex story.
And I think the characters' actions and some of the moral aspects of the theme sort of make more sense when you realize that that's what the story was.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, so before, another sort of disclaimer here is, like, I haven't read any or listened to any interviews with Skyla Hermstrom where he talks about this. So I don't know I don't know for sure that that's what his intention. Basically, there was a lot of talk about this on Twitter for a long time, and basically everybody assumed that that's what he was trying to do. Like this was his twist on the ones who walk away from Omlis, and I believe that. So, I don't. We could be wrong there. So we're working on the assumption that that is what he was intending to be responding to, but we could be wrong.
Yeah. So the original story is I haven't read that, but I'm assuming
I can talk about it a little bit.
I'm just trying to get at the question that it's posing as the theme.
In the original story, it's like it's from the perspective of somebody who grows up in the city, and it's like a perfect city, everybody has perfect health, and then at some point it's revealed that there is some kid that's being tortured in a way that it's not really clear how it does it, but it is the source of the prosperity. And then basically at some point in your life, it's kind of almost like coming of age, you come to learn that that's what makes the city prosperous. And then some people, when they're confronted with that, leave the city. That's what the title is, like the ones who walk away from Omlis, right? And I mean, I think that the intention was that, when you're confronted with that, it's like the moral thing to do is say, I don't want to be a part of this society anymore, and I'm going to leave, right? I don't.
And it's fairly easy to think of things within our own society that we know are not good things that happen that sort of let us live the way that we do. Nike shoes a while, back in the day when they were saying that they were made with child labor, that kind of stuff. Those where how far do you dig to know where your things come from, the stuff like that,
or just other situations like you're part of a club or organization or a church or something that everything seems fine and dandy, and then you discover that there's some not so good things going on. What do? Do you you really enjoy it? Otherwise, do you just sort of hang around and pretend like that stuff isn't going on, or do you leave?
Right. Sure.
I wonder if the story has, is making some references to like actual, like actual child abuse in certain circles. I know there was that whole big thing about some key members of the old science fiction community kind of having these child sexual abuse circles. And I mean, we know that happens in a lot of organizations too, like even churches and things. So I'm kind of wondering if that sort of thing is what the original story was about.
Hard to
say, but I think everybody can kind of see what that theme, or make their own application of that theme.
The Mordu and Kairis in the White City asks a very different question than the original, as far as theme.
Yeah, and just to back up, for people who aren't familiar, so I think we mentioned this, but in Mordu and Kairis in the White City, Mordu's reaction is to not walk away, but to kill everybody except that young woman and the remaining kids that are still alive. Right. So his reaction is not just to walk away, but to sort of apply his own sense of justice to the situation.
Whereas the original story is sort of asking a question about participation. Hermstrom's story is asking about responsibility, and once you're confronted with a truth, with an injustice, who is responsible for fixing the situation? Would you say that's? Yeah,
and I think that's that's a good theme, right? You know, do you just walk away, or do you fix it? Do you actually rescue the people who are being abused? You know, do you bring the people to justice?
Yeah. So, and I think that the answer that Skyla Hermstrom intended,
And it's
Hermstrom, sorry, is that once you are confronted with the truth of injustice, that you are there is a responsibility there that justice be served.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, that's something that was how people interpreted the story, because the whole Twitter discussion around this story is always, oh, the ones who walk away from Omeless is really terrible story because they just walk away. They don't do anything about it. Yeah. It's like, that's people's opinion of it. I don't really agree. I think they're two different, you know, the story's about something different, right?
Yeah.
But that's the general, whether that was Hermstrom's intention, that's the general impression of what the story's about and what people like about it. Is it's like the anti ones who walk away from Omeless. It's like actual justice being applied instead of just walking away.
Yeah. The problem that we see with the theme is that the actual answer that the story presents, going back to those story consequences part of the theme, is if you have power, you are responsible for fighting that injustice. And that if is important, and it's tagged on there because of some of the things that happen in the story. The inverse is true within the context of the story. If you do not have power, you do not have responsibility. And that part of the theme is contributed by the role of the woman. It says some awkward things about, we should say it can be interpreted as saying some awkward things about the role of women and the agency of women in this kind of situation. But in a more general, less gendered sense, people who lack power in general. Because this woman participated, she knew what was going to happen to these children. She had done it before. But she was pardoned.
Yeah.
He did not deal out the same justice to her as he did to everyone else, because she felt bad about it.
Well, so there's a couple details that I just want to point out here.
Yeah.
So I was just re-reviewing my article about the story. So in the story, Mordu starts killing people, but then basically what happens is, because he unplugs this machine from this kid, that he's stopped from actually killing everybody, and the machine either kills everybody else directly or indirectly. So he doesn't actually kill everybody, but he starts and kills quite a few people before that happens. And then when we talk about justice for this character, I want to make it clear, this young woman, her name is Nathia in the story. I want to make it clear that, you know, we're not arguing that in order for him to be consistent, he needs to have physically killed her too. So we were talking about what would be an appropriate response. So in the story, he rescues this woman, and it's something that's sort of hinted or implied is going to happen in the future. It doesn't happen right away because he still needs to work some things out, but it's implied that he's going to take her to be his wife. right? And that doesn't come out of nowhere. That there's some development of that in the story.
Yep.
I mean, one really concrete way that he could have acknowledged her role in this would be he rescues her, and then she kind of is like, are we going to be husband and wife now? And he could just say, no. You were complicit in this. I don't want you near me. I don't want you near my children, right? I am not going to kill you, but whatever thing we had going there is over, right? So that would have been a perfectly fine form of justice for her, that would have acknowledged her
complicity.
Yeah, her complicity in this. But that doesn't happen. It's basically just like he treats her like she didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the best she could do was tip him off to the horror that was occurring. She felt uncomfortable about it, but she couldn't sabotage the machine herself. And maybe that says something about social pressures or something. I don't know.
I don't think the expectation was that she sabotaged the machine. It's that she was complicit in repeatedly bringing more orphans or children into the city for the purpose of having their life force drained by this machine.
Yeah.
Right. She, at the very least, she could say no and walk away from Amalus. Right. Like that, and that would be better than what she did.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I don't think we're being too unfair in our expectations for some of these characters acting a little bit differently in the story. But yeah, so
we're just trying to illustrate how the events of the story impact the author's intended theme,
mm-hmm.
and the way that it ends up being interpreted.
Yeah, and I think the way I ended up reading the story is just, I read it as being a story of moral conflict where people didn't necessarily do the right thing. In the story, Mordu is a pagan, and Kairis, who is a monk that gets turned into a monkey, or who was turned into a monkey, so he's a little monkey throughout the whole story, is a Christian, and he's kind of the voice of a moral, non-utilitarian, justice has to be meted out in the proper way, but Mordu just kind of does his own thing. So I kind of read the story as a sort of cynical, I mean, not necessarily cynical, but just kind of a rumination on, what justice is, with a little bit of conflict. But then again, but then after that, and then the sort of connection to the ones who walk away from Amalus occurred to me, and seeing the Twitter discussion, that's not really how other people read it. They just read it as, oh, Mordu does the right thing. And I think that's a bit surprising to me. And, I think that is what the author's intention was. But because of that sort of inconsistency in how Mordu deals with that young woman, Nathia, I think that interpretation of the theme, or the interpretation of the story, is not going to be what a lot of people take away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that you said when we were discussing this earlier was it kind of ends up being a story of dealing justice to people we don't like,
mm-hmm.
and overlooking the wrongs of people we do like, just giving them a pass.
Mm-hmm.
it's and I just think that it's important that when you're talking about messages in fiction, to consider how the various things that happen in a story are contributing to the intended theme and how they might be detracting. I just think that Alexander Hellene's article might have made it sound quite a bit simpler.
Yeah, I think, and again, I don't think this is something wrong with the article, but I think people, especially from this sort of coming from this sort of pulp rev mindset of we just want to tell entertaining stories. And I mean, Alexander Hellene is arguing against that idea. He's saying you should be intending themes or messages in your work.
Yeah, he says, if I wrote this down, this is my notebook. If you don't think a story has a message or a point, and you don't write it as such, you're not much different than a postmodernist.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, he talks about how even just basic story elements are themes and messages. So I guess what I would be afraid of is that people would sort of take away from it. I can just tell a story and a theme will come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Mordu and Kairis in the White City is a great example of a story that even had a very intentional theme, but
ended up with some contradictory elements.
Yeah. John Della Rose is in the chat, so
hi.
You should say hi. Yeah, so it's a very interesting story, right? And a very interesting theme and purpose that's being addressed. But there's still that conflict between the stated theme and the things that happen in the story. Whereas I think, like, you could make very small changes to the story and it would get way more effective in our opinion. Now, of course, I mean, it's Skylar's story. He can write the story that he wants, but it's interesting to think about what you would do. And just something very simple, like how he interacts with that young woman after what he does, right? If the story didn't end with that sort of implication that they were going to get married someday, but instead he sort of said, I've seen what you were a part of, and I just, I forgive you, but I don't want to be with you anymore. That would basically fix that.
Yeah. I think that this story also shows how readers bring something to the theme too, because David had a very, very different understanding of the story, more of a maybe jaded view of what the story was trying to say than most of the people discussing it on Twitter did. Way different than I did. I came away with it very probably because I am not in the target demographic.
And you weren't familiar with at all with
right, and because I wasn't familiar excuse me, with the story that we believe he was responding to. I came away from it seeing more of a commentary on women and the role of women in a society.
Geez. If that's what you took away from the story, that would be really, really terrible.
Well, right? I was a little bit, I thought it was a good story, and that's why we put the review on Periapsis Press.
Great world building.
Want to hammer that in.
Great world building, really like good characters. Yeah.
I just came away from it thinking that it was saying something about women that was probably not intended.
Yeah.
In addition to, but because of the obvious theme of dealing justice, the commentary on women and the role of women in society was part of that conversation about justice in my mind. But again, that just goes to show how different readers are going to approach a book differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's important to include readers, reader interpretation, reader experience as part of a thematic message, and not obviously it's not the whole thing, right? That would we're in agreement that postmodernism is not.
Well, even just kind of playing off that, maybe a practical application is, thinking about who your audience is. So if you are, and we talked about this actually with some specific examples that I think we don't probably want to bring up and get into here, but like if you're writing a story that, and I don't want to get too much into writing advice either, but if you're writing a story that, say, if you have sort of a Christian audience in mind, or you have Christian themes and you're writing characters that are supposed to be like Christian characters that are supposed to be sympathetic, if you have those characters doing things that sort of violate maybe, say, like a basic Christian understanding of morality, you can totally do that if you want to, but it's going to do things. It's going to screw up your themes. It's going to maybe make your characters unlikable, shift them out of protagonist territory and into anti-hero or antagonist, or just or like unlikable territory, right? So that's important. Whereas maybe you could get away with that if you didn't have that audience in mind.
Yep. Probably most of the books that I read that I don't review on Periapsis Press fall into two categories. One is quality. Author needs more practice and or an editor. And the other is thematic problems, where the message that's conveyed by the story hasn't been considered well, or has been considered and left the way it is. I don't want to throw shade at anybody, so I'm not going to talk specifics, but there's definitely characters who are presented as moral authorities in some form or another, that then condoning behaviors or contradicting that role by participating in immoral behaviors, that kind of thing is it contributes to my understanding of the thematic message of the story. A really easy one to talk about, maybe in a slightly different way, is the role of sex in a story. It's I don't obviously I don't want things to be explicit.
Setting aside,
right,
how much of it you describe, like if it still can be a thing that happens in the story, and
yes, yeah,
and then it should have consequences,
right? That's if a couple in a story has sex, regardless of how that is described in the story, if it's all fade to black, or
or whether it's just straight up erotic.
I didn't mean like that. I meant like, or like in Made in His Image, like there's a very erotic dream,
Yeah. Made in his image is quite explicit at points.
Yep.
Patrick in the chat brought up my book, Uriel's Revenge, because there's some sex in there. But like however it runs, it should be meaningful.
Yeah. There should be, it shouldn't, I have politely said I'm not going to review this. It's a great story, but I'm not going to review this because your characters, your treatment of sex isn't like, it's
just not good.
Either there's no consequences, there's no moving the story forward. It's just there to be the sex scene there. That used to be a thing it probably still is a thing in trad pub. To emphasize the adultness of a work.
And then in a worldview where sex is just, it doesn't have any deeper meaning. I mean, it's an interesting thing that can happen between characters. So, I mean, I don't agree with that worldview, but it can serve a purpose in a story in that worldview, right? Just as something interesting and titillating or, compelling that can happen. So it can be that, but, I want it to be deeper. And just to talk a little bit about my own story, because Patrick brought it up in the chat. In Uriel's Revenge, the two main characters, Brian and Evie, who's the love interest, they basically have. So at the start of the story, they're broken up after a relationship where they were sleeping together when they weren't married, and then over the course of the story, they get back together and sleep and have more premarital sex, and they generally feel there's like a lot of like guilt and a little bit of, there's supposed to be a little bit of a creep factor to it. I mean, Uriel's Revenge is a horror story, so a little bit of an unsettling vibe to things is okay. But the sex in Uriel's Revenge isn't just there to be something interesting. It is actually part of a bigger theme in the book about the meaning of sex and marriage. And hopefully I gave readers enough of that they can get an inkling of what that theme is or put it together. If nobody who reads the book takes that away and they just think it's kind of awkward and creepy and doesn't have a point, then I didn't do my job properly, right? That's on me. So, there's my intention. There's what readers take away. I hope I did a good job of at least kind of portraying it in a way that is meaningful and isn't consequence free. So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to that, but I think sex is a good example of how it's like a very potent thing thematically, and if you don't handle it correctly, you can really goof up your message, I guess I would say. And I think violence is the same way, right? People always talk about sex and violence like, oh, the big thing is like with movies, like, oh, why are you so upset about sex when you're fine with violence? Well, it's like, I'm not really fine with just random violence either, right? If you have violence, it should be, the purpose of it should be somewhat clear, right? It's either moral violence by protagonists, it might be immoral violence by an antagonist. It could be something that is part of making the reader ask questions and get at a theme.
Well, so Morbius came out on Netflix, and I watched it while I was I'm sorry.
When did you watch it? Last week?
I think so. I didn't know that was the one you wanted to watch. I'm sorry.
You failed me again.
Sorry. One of the failings of that movie is that everybody is sympathetic, and there's tons of violence against just people. Usually, especially in a superhero movie, there's and certainly in a sympathetic vampire movie, there's a structure where the hero, if he hurts other people, they've been set up as bad people who deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a suspension of disbelief on the part of the viewer that says, I'm going to set aside my actual feelings about how justice should function in our society. But to have just sort of this wanton violence against people who haven't been set up that way was really disconcerting. And it took me out of the story very, very early.
Yeah. Well, and maybe an example of the opposite of that, not the opposite in the fact that all the violence is moral, but an opposite in the way that you can have this kind of immoral violence between anti-heroes that is on theme is Kill Bill.
Sure, yeah.
Right. So Kill Bill is also a movie where I find pretty much most of the characters in that movie likable, and I'm sympathetic to them on some level. And the violence is also extreme, and everybody's kind of an anti-hero. But the way, and maybe it's just me liking that movie a lot and wanting to interpret it charitably, but I kind of watch Kill Bill, and I think of the themes as kind of a rumination on justice and revenge and the consequences of revenge. It's kind of the classic revenge story where a hero is wronged, sets out to take revenge, but kind of loses something in the process, maybe gains other things in the process, and kind of just sort of a rumination on revenge and what justice looks like. And the characters seem to have an understanding of that in the movie. They all kind of accept their fate in different ways. And, I don't think it really makes a clear statement of what the right answer is. But it's not just a movie about characters doing random stuff. There's there are some messages, like Alexander Hellene talks about in his article, messages below the surface, beyond just the simple statement of what the characters are doing that are worth thinking about.
Oh, catch up in the chat a little bit here. Patrick brought up Spider-Man No Way Home as having poor storylines for villain redemption. And I agree. That movie's trying to do too much, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly not as memorable as the first two.
Yeah.
I remember liking it and thinking it was a fine movie, but I struggle to remember what actually happened in it.
I liked the arcs for the Spider-Man. I thought that the way that they had them play together was very intentional as far as responding to the death of a close one. It was really
just nice. And good-hearted overall.
But the villains were a little bit all over the place.
That just might be an example of, you can't fit too much in a movie, and to give the villains more arcs, there just wasn't there wasn't the time to do it.
Well, there anything else that we want to say about this?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is a great article. It definitely got us thinking about a lot of different aspects of theme and message and stories, and it's definitely a great read. And I like Alexander's blog posts because they often kind of ask a lot of questions. You know, he sort of lays out some ideas and doesn't necessarily say, okay, this is the proper way of thinking about it, but gives a lot of food for thought. So I can't, at the end of the day, I can't say, oh, I disagree with your point, because I think it's all good food for thought. But it's interesting for sure to think about. And I think the unique thing that I'd want to say and reiterate is just, think about, especially if you're trying to write something, think about themes beyond just the obvious, right? Beyond just the main external conflict of your story. Think about what other themes you might want to communicate, and what is happening in your story that is either working against those themes or working for them. Because even very little things, things that could be a one sentence or one paragraph tweak of what happens in the story can have a huge impact on how people are going to either get or not get what your intentions are. And that matters, right? What your intentions are matters, but also whether readers actually understand it and get it matters too.
And I think on the reader's side of it, I think it's important to be an active participant in theme. Obviously, there's a time and a place for just opening a book and reading it and enjoying and not worrying too much. I pretty much have to do that with anything trad pub, but there is a role that you as a reader bring to the messages in fiction. And I think that you shouldn't overstep your bounds in saying this is the theme because this is how I interpret it. But to think of what question is this story asking, and how's the story answering that question, and how would I answer that question is a useful and edifying practice.
Yeah, certainly a story that has intentional themes that are communicated well, you'll get something out of it if you do that. And if there are sort of issues too, you'll also come away with interesting questions. And especially if you're a writer or like telling stories, you might come away with some of your own ideas about how to communicate those things in your own works. And I mean, I guess maybe one other thing I'd want to say too is, you can just write a story without intending themes. I don't think it's a totally invalid thing to do, to just write a story that has a nice structure. But I would say be aware that if you do write something that is compelling and people read it, they're going to find themes in there, whether you intended them or not.
I would say one of the themes that I identified that later the author was intrigued by, because it wasn't something that he'd done intentionally, was in Devil's Dictum, where I talked about in my review how the setting of neglect and decay contributed to the theme of, and like the thematic question of how is our country's founding important? Because the premises of the story is that the United States is founded by pirates instead of by pilgrims. And so how is the faith of our founders important? And that the setting I interpreted as being part of the answer to that question. And he was surprised by that. Or not, maybe not surprised, but it was not something that he had done, that he had intended to be a commentary on that thematic thread. So, like David said, a reader is going to find themes in stuff.
Yeah.
Whether you are putting them in there, every single element on purpose.
Yeah. And that doesn't change the fact that if they find some theme that you didn't intend, it doesn't change the fact that you didn't intend it. Right. But it still is something that they find and they're going to take away. So, I see Alexander's article as calling a writer to think about that. And I think part of thinking about that is intentionally adding themes and thinking about how you're communicating them. So if you do just decide I don't want to do it, be aware that it's still going to be there.
Yep.
And readers might find something deeper than good wins and the hero gets the girl, right? Even if you don't intend it. Actually, one of the cool things about writing is that a lot of times themes will appear in a work and then like in the first draft, and then you can go back and solidify them. That's been my experience with writing. So for sure, if you didn't intend something to happen, it could sort of still be, there could be something there that could be interpreted that way. And again, it doesn't change the fact that you didn't intend it. It doesn't give the reader a right to sort of put whatever they want into it. But, the nature of fiction is such that, not everything is 100% clear. There's going to be things that strike people in different ways and they latch on to. So it's important to think about.
Okay. Let's bring up my closing thing where I just tell you guys support indies. And that looks like reading indies and leaving reviews and interacting with other readers and with authors. The really cool thing about indies is authors tend to be very, very accessible, and you can ask them what they meant and interact with them on Twitter in a very one-on-one way.
Most authors like talking about their books. So if you ask them about what they actually meant, they'll probably tell you.
Happily in a thread. And just let me know if you guys have topics that you'd like us to discuss, or if you guys come across articles that you think it would be interesting to hear us talk about. And if you have anything specific that you like to read about in the sci-fi fantasy genre, let me know, and I can try and find that kind of thing to review.
Yeah, and if you have any more thoughts about this topic, we'd love to interact with you in the comments or on Twitter. Yep. So feel free to let us know.
All right. You guys have a great night. Thank you.
See ya.